Vital school serving as some of our most disadvantaged communities. Yet it was recently identified as a stop school following successive requires improvement Ofsted assessments. I know the staff and leadership at the school are working incredibly hard to drive improvement, and we're starting to see positive signs. So could the Secretary of State please update me on what we are doing to support them?
Is delivering a new era of high and rising school standards, because we know that when standards slip, it is disadvantaged children that suffer, and we won't let that happen. That's why Labour's RISE teams are spearheading a stronger, faster system, prioritising stuck schools, sending in advisors with a proven track record of turning schools around and backing it up with up to £20 million in special...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I invite the Secretary of State to come and visit the outstanding Market Fields Special School in my constituency, which was rebuilt and dramatically expanded under the Conservatives? And listening to what she's been saying about expanding special needs provision, can she give an assurance that the number of special schools and the capacity of special schools will also continue to be expanded, and that we're not returning to the failed policy of the previous Labour government?
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the right honourable gentleman that we will ensure that we have the right numbers of specialist placements in the parts of the country where they are needed, and our capital budget at the spending review will allow us to do that. But we do, alongside that, Mr. Speaker, need to ensure that we have more specialist provision within mainstream, including partnership with the specialist sector to train and support the workforce to make that a reality.
Brinder Singh Jalsan.
Does the Secretary of State agree that plan to make all children in households in receipt of universal credit eligible to free school meals will build on the brilliant work of this government to tackle pupil absence? The incredible numbers I've heard mentioned are 140,000 fewer children persistently absent and 3 million extra school days this academic year.
I completely agree with my honourable friend. Providing over 500,000 children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds with a free, nutritious lunchtime meal every school day will lead to higher attainment, improved behaviour and better outcomes, including on attendance, meaning children can get the best possible education and the chance to succeed in life.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Although her department is providing some extra funds to meet the additional costs of NICs in schools, those with a high number of SEND pupils, like All Saints Primary in Malden, will still be receiving less than 50% of the increase. Exactly. Will she look again at this aspect, which is another disincentive on mainstream schools for taking SEND pupils?
Mr. Speaker, through wider reform later this year, through the Schools White Paper, including to the SEND system, we will look at every way in which we can improve outcomes for children, including with SEND, and that will include looking at funding mechanisms that we inherited from the party opposite.
Aaron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I set up the Corby and East Northampton Round Table to help seek solutions to fix the broken system. One of the outcomes of the discussions was the need to improve SEND provision in our mainstream schools. What is the Minister doing to engage with teachers to make schools more inclusive and maximise the potential of every child?
Minister.
We're investing significantly to make mainstream schools more inclusive for SEND students by strengthening our evidence of effective inclusive practice. We're equipping teachers with proven tools and strategies to deliver excellent inclusive education supported by expert teaching and a world-class curriculum, and we will set out more details in our white paper in the autumn.
John Lunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scottish education was once the envy of the world, but under the SNP it's being destroyed. Data shows a quarter of 11-year-olds in Scotland are not achieving expected literacy levels. So does the Minister agree with me that SNP needs to drop their weird obsessions and get back to the basics of sorting out Scotland's education?
Mr. Speaker, it's only through delivering a Labour government in Scotland next year that we will get the change that the honourable gentleman is seeking. But I do agree with him that it did used to be the case that Scottish education was the envy of the world. I spent many a long day speaking to my own grandfather about his experience through the Scottish system. But it's only with a Labour government that we will once again in Scotland see the focus on standards that our disadvantaged young people badly need.
Peter Swallow.
Earlier this month, I opened the Launchpad, a new SEND provision at Sandhurst School, and I was shown around by Ben, who told me how the Launchpad had helped him access education. As the government works at pace to fix the broken SEND system, what's the Minister's message for young people like Ben?
Minister.
We know there are lots of great examples of mainstream schools delivering specialist provision enabling children to achieve and thrive in mainstream school and providing excellent support to children with speech and language needs, like the one my right honourable friend recently opened. And we have allocated £740 million to support mainstream schools to increase their SEND provision, and we want to reassure his constituent that we will continue to prioritise this in our work.
Sir Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another private school, Queen Margaret's School for Girls in York, has announced its closure months after the Cardiff School in my constituency has announced its closure. Over 11,000 children have left the private sector, which is more than 3 times that the government expected in this first year. So does the Minister believe the impact assessment of the introduction of VAT on private schools is correct, or will she look again at the flawed case for it?
Minister.
Around 50 mainstream private schools close each year. The level of fees charged by private schools is a matter not for the department. This is a contractual matter between private schools and parents.
Colin Anderson.
2 in 5 young people recall receiving any financial education at school, and those who did often received less than an hour per month. So whilst I welcome the government's Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill, which will require all schools to teach financial literacy, does the Minister agree with me that the curriculum and assessment review gives us an opportunity to go even further, and will she meet with me to discuss how government, industry and civil society can ensure that children in my Buckingham and Bletchley constituency get a vital life support?
I absolutely agree with the importance of this, and we are looking at the curriculum and assessment system, making sure that we take the advice of the independent review on these matters. But I'd be more than happy, given his enthusiasm and parents' enthusiasm for this subject, to discuss it further with him.
Judge Hurst.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, last week, the Chancellor committed £9.6 billion over the next 4 years to the school rebuilding programme. Hornsey School and Language College in my constituency is in dire need of a full rebuild. So can the Secretary of State commit today to including Hornsey in the next tranche of rebuilds? And if she needs any persuading, I'd be delighted to invite her on a short detour back on her way to Sunderland to come and have a look herself.
Minister.
We have significantly increased investment to improve the condition of or rebuild schools. Ensuring schools have the resources and buildings that they need is key to our plan for change. If the honourable member would like to write to me about the school, I'd happily update him on this matter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Sign Language, one of the things that the thousands of British Sign Language first language speakers in this country are very supportive of is the introduction of a new BSL GCSE. However, I understand that progress has slightly stalled on that, so I'd be grateful if the Minister could provide an update as to progress of rolling this out.
Minister.
The British Sign Language GCSE is a key feature of our commitment to enhancing the status of British Sign Language, both in education and in society. Ofqual is currently running a public consultation on its proposed assessment arrangements and expects to confirm its decision on the qualification rules in autumn 2025.
Final question, Luke Taylor.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. In April, I wrote to the Minister about the Angel Hill Free School, which would provide 96 desperately needed places for children with SEND in my constituency of Sutton and Cheam. And I thank her for a response in which she said that we would get an update shortly. So I ask again, when she expects construction of the Angel Hill Free School in Rose Hill to begin?
I thank the honourable member for raising this important project. I can confirm that works at Angel Hill Free School are expected to commence in September 2025, subject to the contract being awarded in August.
Let the front benches change over. We now come to the statement from the Home Secretary. Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will update the House on the audit the government commissioned from Baroness Casey on child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs, and on the action we are taking to tackle this vile crime, to put perpetrators behind bars, and to provide the innocent victims of those crimes with support and justice. The House will be aware that on Friday, 7 men were found guilty of the most horrendous crimes in Rochdale between 2000 and 2006. They were convicted of treating teenage girls as sex slaves, repeatedly raping them in filthy flats, alleyways and warehouses. The perpetrators included taxi drivers and market traders of Pakistani heritage and it has taken 20 years to bring them to justice. I want to pay tribute to the incredible bravery of the women who told their stories and have fought for justice through all those years. They should never have been let down for so long. The sexual exploitation of children by grooming gangs is one of the most horrific crimes. Children as young as 10 plied with drugs and alcohol, brutally raped by gangs of men and disgracefully let down again and again by the authorities who were meant to protect them and keep them safe. And these despicable crimes have caused the most unimaginable harm to victims and survivors throughout their lives and are a stain on our society. 5 months ago, I told the House our most important task was to stop perpetrators and put them behind bars. I can report that work is accelerating. Arrests and investigations are increasing. After I asked police forces in January to identify cases involving grooming and child sexual exploitation allegations that had been closed with no further action, more than 800 cases have now been identified for formal review, and I expect that figure to rise above 1,000 in the coming weeks. Let me be clear. Perpetrators of these vile crimes should be off our streets, behind bars, and paying the price for what they have done. Further rapid action is also underway to implement recommendations of past inquiries and reviews, including the 7-year independent inquiry into child abuse, recommendations which for too long have sat on the shelf. So in the Crime and Policing Bill, we are introducing the long overdue mandatory reporting duty, which I called for more than 10 years ago, as well as aggravated offences for grooming offenders so their sentences match the severity of their crimes. And earlier this year, I also commissioned Baroness Louise Casey to undertake a rapid national audit of the nature, scale and characteristics of gang-based exploitation. I specifically asked her to look at the issue of ethnicity and the cultural and social drivers for this type of offending, analysis that had never previously been done, despite years of concerns being raised. And I asked her to advise us on what further reviews, investigations and actions would be needed to address the current and historical failures that she found. I told Parliament in January I expected Baroness Casey to deliver the same kind of impactful and no-holds-barred report that she produced on Rotherham in 2015, so we never shy away from the reality of these terrible crimes. And I am very grateful to Louise and her team that they have done exactly that, with a hugely wide-ranging assessment conducted in just 4 months. The findings of her audit are damning. At its heart, she identifies a deep-rooted failure to treat children as children, a continued failure to protect children and teenage girls from rape, from exploitation and serious violence, and from the scars that last a lifetime. She finds too much fragmentation in the authorities' response, too little sharing of information, too much reliance on flawed data, too much denial, too little justice, too many criminals getting off, too many victims being let down. The audit describes victims as young as 10, often those in care, or children with learning or physical disabilities, being singled out for grooming precisely because of their vulnerability. Perpetrators still walking free because no one joined the dots, or because the law ended up protecting them instead of the victims that they had exploited. Deep-rooted institutional failures, stretching back decades where organisations who should have protected children and punished offenders looked the other way. And Baroness Casey found blindness, ignorance, prejudice, defensiveness, and even good but misdirected intentions all played a part in this collective failure. And on the key issues of ethnicity that I'd asked her to examine, she has found continued failure to gather proper, robust national data, despite concerns being raised going back very many years. In the local data that the audit examined from 3 police forces, they identify clear evidence of overrepresentation among suspects of Asian and Pakistani heritage men, and she refers to examples of organisations avoiding the topic altogether for fear of appearing racist or raising community tensions. These findings are deeply disturbing. But most disturbing of all, as Baroness Casey makes clear, is the fact that too many of these findings are not new. As Baroness Casey's audit sets out, there have been 15 years of reports, reviews, inquiries and investigations into these appalling rapes, exploitation and violent crimes against children, detailed over 17 pages in her report, but too little has changed. We have lost more than a decade. That must end now. Baroness Casey sets out 12 recommendations for change. We will take action on all of them immediately because we cannot afford more wasted years. So we will introduce new laws to protect children and support victims so they stop being blamed for the appalling crimes committed against them. New major police operations to pursue perpetrators and put them behind bars. New national inquiry to direct local investigations and hold institutions to account for past failures. New ethnicity data and research so we face up to the facts on exploitation and abuse. New action across children's services and other agencies to identify children at risk. And further action to support child victims and tackle the new forms of exploitation and abuse online. Taken together, this will mark the biggest programme of work ever pursued to root out the scourge of grooming gangs and child sexual exploitation. Those vile perpetrators who have grown used to the authorities looking the other way must have no place to hide. So let me spell out the next steps we're announcing today. Baroness Casey's first recommendation is we must see children as children. She concludes too many grooming cases have been dropped or downgraded from rape to lesser charges because a 13 to 15-year-old is perceived to have been in love with or had consented to sex with the perpetrator. So we will change the law to ensure that adults who engage in penetrative sex with a child under 16 face the most serious charge of rape. And we will work closely with the CPS and the police to ensure there are safeguards for consensual teenage relationships. We will change the law so that those convicted for child prostitution offences, while their rapists got off scot-free, will have their convictions disregarded and their criminal records expunged. Baroness Casey's next recommendation is a national criminal operation. As I've set out, arrests and investigations are rising, but the audit recommends us going further. So I can announce the police will launch a new national criminal operation into grooming gangs, overseen by the National Crime Agency, bringing together for the first time all arms of the policing response, and will develop a rigorous new national operating model which all forces across the country will be able to adopt, ensuring grooming gangs are always treated as serious and organised crime. And so rapists who groom children, whether their crimes were committed decades ago or are still being committed today, can end up behind bars. But alongside justice, there must also be accountability and action. We've begun implementing the recommendations from inquiries past, including Professor Jay's independent inquiry, and we've said that further inquiries are needed to get accountability in local areas. I told the House in January I would undertake further work to look at how to ensure those inquiries could get the evidence they needed to properly hold institutions to account, and we have sought responses from local councils too. We asked Baroness Casey to review those responses as well as the arrangements and powers that had been used in past investigations and inquiries to consider the best means to get to the truth. Her report concludes that further local investigations are needed, but they should be directed and overseen by a national commission with statutory inquiry powers. We agree, and we will set up a national inquiry to that effect. Baroness Casey is not recommending another overarching inquiry of the kind conducted by Professor Alexis Jay, and she recommends that the inquiry should be time limited. But its purpose must be to challenge what the audit describes as continued denial, resistance and legal wrangling among local agencies, and we will set out the further details on the national inquiry in due course. Mr. Speaker, I warned in January that the data collection we had inherited from the previous government on ethnicity was completely inadequate. It was only collected on 37% of suspects. Baroness Casey's audit confirms that ethnicity data is not recorded for 2/3 of grooming gang perpetrators, and she says it is not good enough to support any statements about the ethnicity of group-based child sexual exploitation offenders at the national level. I agree with that conclusion, and frankly it is ridiculous and helps no one that this basic information is not collected, especially when there have been warnings and recommendations stretching back 13 years about the woefully inadequate data on perpetrators, which prevents patterns of crime being understood and tackled. The immediate changes I announced in January to police recording practices are starting to improve the data, but we will need to go much further. Baroness Casey's audit examined local level data in 3 police force areas, Greater Manchester, West Yorkshire and South Yorkshire, where high-profile cases involving Pakistani heritage men have long been investigated and reported, and there they found the suspects of group-based child sexual offences were disproportionately likely to be Asian men. She also found indications of disproportionality in serious case reviews. And while much more robust national data is needed, we cannot and must not shy away from these findings because, as Baroness Casey says, ignoring the issues, not examining and exposing them to the light, allows the criminality and depravity of a minority of men to be used to marginalise whole communities. The vast majority of people in our British, Asian and Pakistani heritage communities continue to be appalled by these terrible crimes and agree that the criminal minority of sick predators and perpetrators in every community must be dealt with robustly by the criminal law. Baroness Casey's review also identifies prosecutions and investigations into perpetrators who are white, British, European, African or Middle Eastern, just as Alexis Jay's inquiry concluded that all ethnicities and communities were involved in appalling child abuse crimes. So to provide accurate information to help tackle serious crimes, we will make it a formal requirement for the first time to collect both ethnicity and nationality data for all cases of child sexual abuse and exploitation, and we will commission new research into the cultural and social drivers of child sexual exploitation, misogyny and violence against women and girls, as Baroness Casey has recommended. The final group of recommendations from the audit is about the continued failure of agencies who should be keeping children safe to share vital information or act on clear signs of risk. And worryingly, the audit finds that whilst reports of child sexual abuse and exploitation to the police have gone up, the number of child sexual abuse cases identified for protection plans by local children's services has fallen to its lowest ever level, but no one has been curious as to why. And the audit details an abysmal failure to respond to 15 years' worth of recommendations and warnings about the failings of interagency cooperation. So we will act at pace to deliver on Baroness Casey's recommendations on mandatory sharing of information between agencies and on unique reference numbers for children, the work already being taken forward by my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary. And my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, will also work at pace to close loopholes in the law on taxi licensing. Finally, I want to respond to 3 other important issues identified by Baroness Casey in her report, but where she has not made specific recommendations. On support for victims, my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will fund additional training for mental health staff in schools on identifying and supporting children and young people who have experienced trauma, exploitation and abuse. Secondly, Baroness Casey reports that she came across cases involving suspects who were asylum seekers. We have asked her team to provide to the Home Office all the evidence that they found, so the immigration enforcement can immediately pursue individual cases with the police. But let me make clear, those who groom children or who commit sexual offences will not be granted asylum in the UK. We will do everything in our power to remove them. I do not believe the law is strong enough that we have inherited, so we are bringing forward a change to the law so that anyone convicted of sexual offences is excluded from the asylum system and denied refugee status. We've already increased the removal of foreign national offenders by 14% since the election, and we're drawing up new arrangements to identify and remove those who have committed a much wider range of offences. Finally, Baroness Casey describes ways in which patterns of grooming gang child sexual exploitation are changing, including evidence of rape and sexual exploitation taking place in street gangs and drug gangs that combine criminal and sexual exploitation. I do not believe that this kind of exploitation has been sufficiently investigated. It also describes sexual exploitation in modern slavery and trafficking cases, and most significant of all, it describes the huge increase in online grooming and horrendous sexual exploitation and abuse, including the use of social media apps to build up relationships and lure children into physical abuse. And the audit quotes one police expert saying, "If Rotherham were to happen again today, it would start online." So, Mr. Speaker, we are also passing world-leading new laws to target those who groom and exploit children online, investing in cutting-edge technology to target the highest harm offenders, but we will need to do much more, or the new scandals and shameful crimes of the future will be missed. When the final report of Alexis Jay's 7-year national inquiry was published in October 2022, the then Home Secretary, Grant Shapps, issued a profound and formal public apology to the victims of child sexual abuse so badly let down over decades by different levels of the state. As Shadow Home Secretary at that time, I joined him in that apology on behalf of the opposition and extended it to victims of child sexual exploitation too. To the victims and survivors of sexual exploitation and grooming gangs, on behalf of this and past governments and the many public authorities who let you down, I want to reiterate an unequivocal apology for the unimaginable pain and suffering that you have suffered and the failure of our country's institutions through decades to prevent that harm and keep you safe. But words are not enough. Victims and survivors need action. The reforms I've set out today will mean the strongest action any government has taken to tackle child sexual exploitation, more police investigations, more arrests, a new inquiry, changes to the law to protect children, and a fundamental overhaul of the way organisations work to support victims and put perpetrators behind bars. But none of this will work unless everyone is part of it, unless everyone works together to keep our children safe. I commend this statement to the House.
Right. Hopefully it's now available in the table office for those members who wish to see the report. The other thing is, the Home Secretary quite rightly took longer than expected, and I have no problem in that. Just to say to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch, the same is available as well, and to the Lib Dems. Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Lady for advance sight of this statement. Although I must say, I couldn't believe my ears, listening to the Home Secretary's statement as if this was their plan all along, when we all know it is another U-turn. After months of pressure, the Prime Minister has finally accepted our calls for a full statutory national inquiry into the grooming gangs. And I welcome that we have finally reached this point. And we must remember that this is not a victory for politicians, especially the ones like the Home Secretary who had to be dragged to this position, or the Prime Minister. This is a victory for the survivors who have been calling for this for years. I have been speaking to many who do not have confidence that a government that ignored their concerns will deliver. But before I turn to the detail of the Home Secretary's statement, I want to recognise the tireless work of those who refuse to let this issue be buried. Survivors like Fiona Goddard, who bravely waived her anonymity, and the parents of survivors like Marlon West, who I spoke to this morning. Maggie Oliver, whose courage in speaking truth to power has been instrumental in bringing us to this point. The late Andrew Norfolk, whose fearless journalism brought these crimes to light, Baroness Casey for her review, and Charlie Peters, who has consistently been a voice for the voiceless. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's handling of this scandal is an extraordinary failure of leadership. His judgment has once again been found wanting. Since he became Prime Minister, he and the Home Secretary dismissed calls for an inquiry because they did not want to cause a stir. They accused those of us demanding justice for the victims of this scandal as, and I quote, jumping on a far-right bandwagon. Yes. A claim the Prime Minister's official spokesman restated this weekend. Shameful. It has been left to Conservatives time and time again to force this issue. 3 times, Mr. Speaker. 3 times. They can mutter now. They all mutter now. 3 times, Mr. Speaker, these Labour MPs voted against the national inquiry. They voted against it 3 times. Liberal Democrats didn't bother to vote at all, asleep at the wheel. Labour MPs voted against a reasoned amendment to the Children's Bill. At committee stage of that bill, they voted against. At committee stage of the crime and policing...
Mr. Swallow, I want you to set a good example. It's a very serious debate. Temps are running high, but I certainly don't want you to see you pointing and shouting and bawling in that way. Okay, Ben.
Mr. Speaker, they can point and shout as much as they like. They know the truth as we on the side of the House do. Yes. 3 times, I will repeat myself, Mr. Speaker, 3 times. Labour MPs voted against a reason amendment to the Children's Bill. At committee stage of that bill, they voted against. At committee stage of the Crime and Policing Bill, they voted against a national inquiry. And at Prime Minister's questions, the Prime Minister repeatedly ruled out a national inquiry to the chairs of all of these Labour MPs who are now pretending this is what they believed all along. And no doubt, the Home Secretary, in her response to me, will try and claim that the previous government did nothing. Yes. A wholly false assertion that she should not repeat today. The Conservative government took extensive action, starting with the original Jay report, commissioned in 2014 by the then Home Secretary Theresa May. A year later, she commissioned the independent investigation into child sexual abuse, and Sajid Javid commissioned ethnicity data collection in 2018. So it is wrong, as the Home Secretary said, to claim that ethnicity data collection had not been done, and I will remind her that the Foreign Secretary criticised Sajid Javid at the time, said he was bringing the Office of Home Secretary into disrepute and said he was pandering to the far right for doing exactly what she says she's doing now. They should be ashamed of themselves. We accepted all the recommendations of that previous child sexual inquiry of 2022, except the one to have a new cabinet minister, which would not have made any difference at all to the victims of this scandal. The Home Secretary claimed that the recommendations sat on the shelf. Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. We went further than those recommendations. It was the Conservatives who established the Grooming Gangs Task Force, which supported police forces to make 807 arrests for group-based child sexual exploitation last year. So don't tell me we did nothing. It is vital, Mr. Speaker, that this inquiry is robust, swift, and above all, independent. There are legitimate concerns about institutions investigating themselves, especially as some of the most egregious cases of institutional failure occurred in Labour-controlled authorities. They can moan as much as they like, Mr. Speaker, but the people out there believe that is why nothing has happened yet. In Greater Manchester, Operation Augusta was prematurely shut down. In Rotherham, under continuous Labour control since 1974, we saw repeated failures. In Telford, where Labour has predominantly held power, the current MP initially rejected calls for an inquiry while serving as council leader. This inquiry must have teeth. It must start with known hotspots like Bradford and Rochdale, and I commend my honourable friend, the member for Keighley, for his persistent advocacy of this issue. We need clear commitments, Mr. Speaker. For example, will the inquiry examine the role of ethnicity in these crimes, confronting hard truths about potential cover-ups motivated by fears of appearing racist? There's no point then muttering. The Home Secretary said it herself. I spoke to the father of a survivor just this morning, and he told me the survivors need to have someone who is independent that they can go to and trust. It is no use them being forced to speak to the same authorities who ignored them in the first place. So will this inquiry ensure that no one whether police officers, councillors or council officials, is beyond scrutiny. The government's approach to the Casey review itself raises serious concerns. While the review's findings are crucial, we as legislators are sent here to make decisions, not to outsource the difficult ones. The Prime Minister has waited months for someone to take this decision for him. This is the kind of dithering and delay that the survivors complained about. Mr. Speaker, we need answers to the following questions. The House deserves to know what changed the Prime Minister's mind from thinking this was dog whistle far-right politics to something he must do. When exactly did Baroness Casey submit her findings to Downing Street, and did the government request any changes to her report? Does she agree that anyone in authority who deliberately covered up these disgusting crimes should be prosecuted for misconduct in public office, and those prosecutions should happen alongside, not after, the inquiry? Because we believe that anyone in the police, local authorities, social services, or even the CPS who covered this up because they cared more about so-called community relations than about protecting vulnerable girls as young as 10 years old should be pursued. And we welcome her comments about perpetrators not being able to make asylum claims. I will remind the Home Secretary that we put forward an amendment in the Borders Bill, and she and all her colleagues voted against that very measure. So does she now agree that perpetrators should also not be able to make human rights claims to avoid deportation, and will she legislate to do that? Will the inquiry be concluded within 2 years, and will every one of the 50 towns affected be covered, including Bradford, which is still refusing to conduct an inquiry into this? And will those local inquiries have the power to summon witnesses, or is that power only for the national inquiry? And most critically, we need a clear timeline for conclusions and actions. The victims cannot wait another decade for justice. We should be able to do this in 2 years. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we didn't need to commission a report to tell us what we already knew. So will she apologise on behalf of herself, the Labour Party and the Prime Minister for wasting so much time and voting against this, dismissing the concerns of the survivors? The House, the British public, and most importantly, the many brave survivors deserve clear answers from a government of dithering and delay.
What was the answer you gave the survivors? I have to say to the Leader of the Opposition, I don't think she can have read this report and the seriousness of its conclusions, because it sets out a timeline of failure from 2009 to 2025. Repeated reports and recommendations that were not acted on child protection, on police investigations, on ethnicity data, on data sharing, on support for victims. For 14 of those 16 years, her party was in government, including years when she was the Minister for Children and Families, then the Minister for Equalities, covering race and ethnicity issues and violence against women and girls. And I didn't hear her raise any of these issues until January of this year. She will know the Prime Minister didn't just raise them, he acted on them, bringing the first prosecutions against grooming gangs, calling for action to address ethnicity issues in 2012. And she will know that the Safeguarding Minister and I have raised these issues repeatedly. She referred to the Professor Alexis Jay independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. I called for and strongly supported that inquiry, and also on a cross-party basis. We wanted that inquiry to work and supported its conclusions. But her party did absolutely nothing to implement those conclusions. Time and again, recommendations just sitting on the shelf. And it has taken this government now to bring forward the mandatory duty to report. And she says that we should ensure
that people who have engaged in cover-ups should be prosecuted. I agree, and that is why this party is changing the law to make that possible, so that cover-ups cannot happen and so that people are held to account. She'll also know that the votes she's referred to, what she wanted to do, and the amendment she put forward, would have wrecked the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill. The very bill which includes 2 of Baroness Casey's recommendations strengthening child protection, recommendations that she and her party refused to introduce over 14 years. And I am sorry that she chose not to join in the apology to victims and survivors for decades of failure that was a cross-party apology in 2022. And it should be again if she really had victims' interests and the national interest at heart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I sat with a cold fury at what was coming out of the mouth of the Leader of Opposition. Because much of it is beneath contempt. Can I commend today's statement, and can I commend her for commissioning a fiercely independent figure like Louise Casey to conduct this national audit, without which we would not have had today's outcome. In Rochdale, we know all too well how many years it has taken for victims to get the justice they deserve. They have waited many, many years to see these sick criminals locked up and put behind bars. But also, I mean, only last week we had 7 more of these perverts locked up in Rochdale, and that is a testimony to the police and the prosecution who finally got these cases together. But the victims also want accountability for anyone in position of authority, as she has said, anyone who found out about this and failed to act, or knew about it and failed to act. So does she agree with me that no councillor of any political party, no social worker, no police officer, no council officer and no ethnic group should hide from the fierce scrutiny of this national inquiry?
My honourable friend is right to raise the appalling case in his constituency where 7 people were convicted on Friday. And he will know as well that there are further criminal investigations still ongoing as well, and it is shameful how long it has taken to get justice for those victims. I also agree with him that there can be no hiding from justice for anyone on this appalling issue where victims and survivors have been let down for far too long, and I would hope that this could be a cross-party process to support that.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Child sexual abuse and exploitation are among the most abhorrent crimes imaginable, and we must all support every effort to deliver justice for victims and to prevent these vile acts from happening again. It is, of course, right that the government follows the recommendations of Baroness Casey's report, including a new national inquiry. Survivors must be at the heart of this process. Their voices, experiences and insights must shape both the inquiry and its outcomes. And I would welcome hearing more from the Home Secretary on how she intends to ensure survivors are heard, respected and central to this view, building on their existing testimony without asking to repeat themselves and relive their abuse again and again. Mr. Speaker, the 7-year inquiry into child sexual abuse, chaired by Professor Alexis Jay, delivered its final report in 2022, and the government at the time delivered none of its recommendations, leaving survivors waiting for justice. In her remarks, the Home Secretary mentioned 2 of Professor Jay's recommendations being introduced through the Crime and Policing Bill: mandatory reporting duty and aggravated offences for grooming offenders. But what does this new inquiry mean for the remaining recommendations of Professor Jay? Will victims and survivors see all 20 recommendations implemented while the new inquiry is being carried out? Any new inquiry must be more than symbolic. It must be robust, victim-centred and capable of driving real change. A duty of candour would require public officials and authorities to cooperate fully with an inquiry like this. So it continues to be disappointing that the government has delayed bringing this forward. I ask the Home Secretary plainly, what is stopping the government from introducing a duty of candour via a Hillsborough law now? Finally, now that Baroness Casey has completed her review, I welcome her appointment as chair of the Independent Commission into Adult Social Care. I trust she will bring to that hugely important role the same determination to challenge injustice and champion the voices of those too often left unheard.
The honourable member makes important points about the seriousness of this crime. She is right too that we need to continue to implement the recommendations of the overarching inquiry into child abuse. The Safeguarding Minister updated the House before Easter on those recommendations and the action that we are taking forward on those. I can tell her that a lot of the Home Office measures are already well underway as well, and we will continue to do that. It's really important that we don't simply have recommendations sitting on shelves, that things have to be implemented. On the Hillsborough law, we are working at pace to get the details right and bring it before the House. She will understand that it needs to meet the expectations of the Hillsborough families as well as be right for the House too. And we will continue to work on the wider issues as well. Baroness Casey in her foreword says, if we'd got this right years ago, seeing these girls as children raped rather than wayward teenagers or collaborators in their abuse, collecting ethnicity data and acknowledging as a system that we did not do a good enough job, then I doubt we'd be in this place now. We lost a decade. We can't lose another one.
Naz Shah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first thank the Home Secretary for her statement and for her leadership and commitment to get a grip on this issue. As a Member of Parliament for one of the largest constituencies, Muslim and Pakistani heritage people, Muslims, I know the sheer anger and condemnation that the vast majority of them share, like all Britons, against those that commit these vile actions and vile sexual abuse. This is not only backed by recent polling by opinion that shows Muslims are deeply concerned, majority of them, about grooming gangs, but by sermons in mosques, letters from leading figures, demonstrations on the streets, and so much more, often not given the media coverage that they deserve. I am pleased to see the National Crime Agency will be involved in the future inquiries, and let me reiterate in this House that British Muslims stand on the side of victims and support the full force of the law against all perpetrators of abuse. But would the Home Secretary agree with me that those that display selective outrage or fan the flames to blame entire communities do nothing to protect innocent victims or further the cause of victims?
Can I welcome my honourable friend's points that she makes about the anger in her community, the anger across British Muslim communities towards the grooming gangs, towards the rape of children, towards these appalling crimes, and the work that she has long called for, including stronger action from the police to be able to go after perpetrators and bring them to justice. She is right that this is shared right across communities, is the horror at crimes committed against children and particularly against young girls. It is in the interests of those children and of those victim survivors that we have reforms now.
The First Select Committee, Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for her statement and for early sight of it. I'm pleased also that Baroness Casey has agreed to come before the committee tomorrow to set out her report more clearly to us. I am concerned about the potential for inquiries trying to get to the truth, potentially prejudicing criminal trials. So could she set out how she envisages the two things running alongside each other, an inquiry and criminal prosecutions?
Can I welcome that question from the Select Committee Chair, and I am glad that Baroness Casey will have the opportunity to set out more details of her findings. As the Chair will know, the Baroness Casey has huge expertise and determination and will be forthright in giving the evidence that she has drawn together. She makes a very important point, and it will be important for the Independent Commission, for the Independent Inquiry, to have arrangements with police forces to ensure that where there are current criminal investigations underway, they are not cut across, but so that we also ensure that we can uncover where there have been institutional failings, because it's those institutional failings to pursue action or to turn a blind eye towards action that need to be pursued in particular areas as part of those local investigations and as part of the national inquiry. She'll know that these kind of arrangements have been done in inquiries in the past, so they can be done and will need to be so again now.
Sean Davies.
First, I want to praise and pay tribute to survivors from right across the country, and again highlight the survivors who worked in Telford alongside myself and other organisations to do that local-based review. The reason we did a local-based review was because the then Home Secretary Amber Rudd and the then local government Minister Rishi Sunak refused to provide a statutory inquiry into Telford. And that's why we worked together with the Police and Crime Commissioner, who happens to be a Conservative, and people from across the political spectrum to take this out of the party political field and try and find answers in our small part of the world. Mr. Speaker, what we do need, though, is action. Action in regards to the Jay inquiry, action in regards to the Casey review, but also, Home Secretary, the number of local reviews that have taken place up and down this country that have not been on the desks of ministers over the last 14 years and have not therefore received the attention that they deserve. Does she agree?
My honourable friend is right to say what we need is change and action. Recommendations from inquiries need to be implemented. The Telford inquiry that took place had as part of its strength was that it involved victims and survivors at the very heart of the inquiry, and also had serious plans to ensure that the recommendations were then taken forward and implemented, and had ways in which to follow up to make sure that those recommendations were implemented. That is crucial. It's no good just having inquiries where recommendations sit on a shelf. We have to make sure that they are implemented alongside pursuing answers.
Robin Moore.
Thank you. And can I just start by saying that the fact that victims and survivors of this horrific crime have quite literally had to become campaigners themselves to reach this outcome is something that should make everybody in this House stop and think. When I last met the Safeguarding Minister with leading child abuse lawyer David Greenwood, we pointed out the very fundamental flaw in her own government's grooming gang strategy, and that was the completely ridiculous decision to give council leaders in areas like Keighley and the wider Bradford district the option to simply say no to an inquiry. So now that we have an inquiry equipped with statutory powers, can I ask the Home Secretary, what message does she have for local leaders in my region who think that they can still get away with saying no? And what message does she have to say to victims like Fiona Goddard, who is also from my area, who no doubt will be worrying, like me, that there will still be no focus on Keighley and the wider Bradford district?
Well, I know that the honourable member has met with the Safeguarding Minister. She has also spoken again to Fiona Goddard this morning to ensure that the work that they have been doing and to make sure that victims and survivors' voices and campaigners' voices are heard at the heart of this. I think he will also know that the Safeguarding Minister did say to him in that meeting that she would not allow local councils to be able to turn their backs and to say no to investigations where they are needed. That is why we have accepted Baroness Casey's recommendation for a national inquiry that will underpin those local investigations. We will ensure, obviously, final decisions will be matters for the independent chair of the Commission, but we will ensure that his concerns and those of victims are passed on to the national inquiry.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my right honourable friend for her statement. I'd also like to pass on my thanks to Dame Louise Casey for meeting with Oldham victims and survivors of CSE. They want no further delays to justice and for perpetrators to face the full face of the law now. It is unacceptable that some are being given court dates of 2028 with all the risks that implies. They want no more red tape. They want survivors to be at the heart of rooting out these perpetrators and getting justice. Can the Home Secretary ensure that this will happen? And will she now consider making misogyny a hate crime?
I welcome the work that my honourable friend has done through very many years to champion victims in Oldham, to champion victims across her constituency and to work with survivors as well. She is right to point to the terrible delays in the justice system. She will know that the Lord Chancellor is taking forward reforms to look at how the huge backlog, particularly in Crown Court cases, can be dealt with, because justice delayed is justice denied, and already so many of the survivors have waited far too long for justice. I can assure her that those concerns are very much uppermost in the Lord Chancellor's mind.
Pritchard. Where there have been local inquiries commissioned by councils, will there be an opportunity for those same areas to fall under the remit of this national inquiry to ensure that some of the issues that the Home Secretary herself references today are still ongoing, are caught within the new framework of the new inquiry?
The question he raises is an important one, and ultimately the final decisions will need to be for the independent chair and the commission. That's what happens when we set it up as a national inquiry rather than a government process. But he was right. He will know that, for example, there have been concerns raised around investigations and inquiries that have taken place around Greater Manchester, having final areas that they were not able to compel or to get to the bottom of. They have worked as a result with the Her Majesty's Inspectorate for Policing in order to be able to pursue the final stages of an investigation inquiry. And we did look at whether there were other powers, either through local government acts or through in police inspection powers. However, the simplest way to address this is for it to be done through the national inquiry, and he will be able to make representations around his area, so will any other MPs be able to make representations on their area too.
Pegs.
By welcoming this statement and the absolute determination of Baroness Casey and this government to hold the perpetrators to account and to hold to account those who may have been involved in cover-ups. One of the recommendations that comes through in the report is around the confusion between different agencies. A particular element around that is around taxi licensing and taxis from out-of-town areas. Yeah. And I know definitely from my own city of Peterborough, the challenge both to law-abiding, decent taxi drivers undercut by different licensing laws, but also law enforcement and the safety of passengers where we have plates from different areas. I note that's one of the recommendations. Can my right honourable friend give us more details of how we will move at speed to create a national level playing field so that passengers are safe and drivers have the support they need to keep everyone safe?
Yeah.
I welcome that point from my honourable friend, because he will know there are many local authorities across the country who have worked to ensure that they raise standards and checks in their licensing arrangements, particularly those in areas where there have been serious problems and where there have been criminal cases that have taken place. However, those checks and safeguards can end up being undermined by the licensing of taxis in other areas that do not have those checks. So we are looking to be able to take forward reforms to the law. The Transport Secretary is looking at exactly this issue to make sure we can find a way forward to close that loophole.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. As a survivor of child sexual abuse myself, I stand in solidarity with the many victims and survivors. The system has failed over many, many years. And I can say that the horror, the trauma, the guilt never leaves you. And I so hope that every survivor who is identified here receives the mental health support and otherwise that they deserve to help rebuild their lives. Survivors have witnessed very many promises, 20 recommendations, and the call of never again, time and again. What will the Home Secretary do, and how will she reassure them that this won't be another one of those examples? And can I just say, too, that I am really let down and disgusted that the Leader of the Opposition began her remarks with a party political assault on her opponents like this. Victims and survivors deserve more than a smug "I told you so" diatribe. Victims and survivors deserve action.
Can I thank the Honourable Member for speaking out about his experience, and I do not underestimate how brave and how difficult it can be to do that, and he will be just giving all kinds of support to other victims and survivors simply by the fact that he has done so. He is right to raise the challenge about how do we ensure that recommendations are actually implemented. He will know that on the issue about therapeutic support, we do want to extend therapeutic support to victims and survivors, but we will start, as the Health Secretary is setting out, we will start by providing additional support and training for those who provide mental health support in our schools.
Charlotte Littles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At Manchester Minshall Crown Court last week, 7 men were convicted for sickening crimes as part of a grooming gang. One of their victims, girl A, who was abused by in excess of 50 men, was advised by police to make a claim for criminal injuries compensation, for which she would have received just £22,000. She did not make a claim, but this did not stop the defence from arguing that she made up accusations to bolster a claim for compensation. The government will be aware that I've raised on many occasions the inadequacies of the criminal injuries compensation framework for victims of sexual violence and exploitation, and will be aware of recommendations from the ICSA review and the Victims Commissioner on this. While no amount of money could be adequate to compensate victims like Girl A, we owe it to them to ensure they have the financial support required to rebuild their lives and do not have to choose between this and justice. How much longer will we all be waiting for this?
Thank my honourable friend for raising this. The Safeguarding Minister takes this issue very seriously, and the way in which we cannot have issues around the criminal injuries compensation scheme being raised in court in a way that undermines the victims and survivors who have shown bravely that they are able to speak out about abuse that has haunted their lives for so long. We will look at this issue further.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome this statement from the Home Secretary and that there will now be a national inquiry. Does the Home Secretary think that that will be finished within, let's say, 2 years for the British people? And given that she quite rightly apologised to the victims and survivors, will she now apologise on behalf of the Prime Minister who smeared and labelled those of us who called for a national inquiry?
Yeah.
Well, he raises the issue about the timescale for this, and the so in the discussions that we have had with Baroness Casey, and also recognising the many issues that people want to raise with an inquiry, we had expected that it might take around 3 years. Clearly, if the Commission is able to work faster than that, then people will clearly want answers as swiftly as possible. But final details about the timings will obviously need to be determined. I think we do need to make sure that we are both implementing the recommendations of previous inquiries and also making sure that we are pursuing these further investigations in local areas as swiftly as possible. And I do reiterate in my statement earlier the recognition of the huge harm that has been done to victims and survivors through decades, and I would urge him to look at that section of Louise Casey's report with the 17 pages of failure year after year after year to follow through and to take action, and I do believe that victims and survivors are owed an apology for that failure over very many years.
Florence Eshelome.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say there are many issues in this House which we may disagree on, but an issue of this magnitude is something that should bring all of us as parliamentarians together to work to ensure we get justice for those victims. The Home Secretary has outlined the next phase of this, but if we're really honest with ourselves, for every victim who's come forward to share her horrific testimony, there are so many more girls up and down the country who have not come forward. So it's in their interest that we make sure we get this right as a country. The Home Secretary has outlined the issues around data and the lack of data gathering. One of the areas I've raised consistently is around criminal exploitation by gangs who sexually exploit young people and then use them to carry out their horrific county lines up and down the country. Does the Home Secretary agree that collection of data must also lay with the Met Police forces, other chief police forces across the country and British Transport Police?
My honourable friend is right that so many victims and survivors don't come forward, and we need to make it easier for people to do so and recognise the scale of the abuse that takes place. But I agree with her on this really important issue about the county lines and the interaction between criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation. Too often the county lines and criminal exploitation is seen as an issue involving teenage boys, but very often teenage girls are also drawn in, and very often that also means sexual exploitation as well. I don't believe enough investigation has been done yet into this particular pattern and form of child sexual abuse and exploitation. As we strengthen the law on criminal exploitation of children, we need to make sure that this issue is properly pursued, as she says, as part of the data gathering, but further research as well.
Esther Magnan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has been dragged kicking and screaming to deliver a national inquiry, having dismissed the pleas of a nation for one as jumping on a far-right bandwagon. This reluctance is why my honourable friend for Great Yarmouth will continue with his inquiry, and I will be supporting him in this. But can I ask the Home Secretary, will this government's inquiry investigate the political motivations behind the cover-ups, including the role of the Labour Party, or will this continue to be swept under the carpet?
What I say to the honourable member is I think everyone should want not just to get to the truth about past failures, but also to make sure that we make the changes to protect children for the future as well. That includes changes in social services, it includes changes in policing and the police operation that I hope that she would welcome to take action to put perpetrators behind bars, and also the action to gather proper ethnicity data, which simply has not been gathered properly before, and where Louise Casey's report is very clear. It is totally inadequate, the data gathering that her government, her previous government, left behind. So I hope she would agree to all of those being extremely important so that we can get stronger protection and truth for victims.
Elsie Blunder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government's announcement that there will be a national inquiry. Every penny spent on stamping out the evil of child abusers is money well spent. And although welcome, notice of this inquiry will undoubtedly cause a great deal of trauma and distress for both historic and present-day victims as violations committed against them are revisited. As the honourable member opposite referenced, what steps can the government take to ensure that victims and witnesses have access to robust mental health support, and how can we ensure that our courts, as my honourable friend, the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth mentioned, especially in places like Greater Manchester, which face extensive court backlogs, are sufficiently resourced to ensure that at the end of this process, justice is finally delivered?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I know she has championed victims and survivors in her area and community, and she is right to say that we have to make sure that victims and survivors get support. 7,000 victims and survivors gave evidence to the original Alexis Jay, Professor Alexis Jay inquiry. That's why it's so important that they did not do so in vain, and we make the reforms and the changes for that recommendation. But she's also right to say we need to increase the therapeutic support for victims and survivors, and that will start with providing additional support for children.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. And one of the reasons 6 months ago in January I wasn't supportive of the strategy the government had was the fact that it couldn't compel local inquiries to bring forward witnesses. That is a key bit. Now, in listening to her answers very carefully, could she clarify, will those local inquiries be able to compel witnesses? Is it them? Is it the national side as well? And will those powers be used to ensure there is no stone unturned?
So the answer is yes, and I do recognise that this is an issue that the Honourable Member has raised. I did say back in January that I would undertake further work to make sure that the local investigations did have the powers to compel witnesses to be able to get the evidence. We have concluded, we agree with Baroness Casey, that the right way to do this is to have the national inquiry. So that national inquiry will mean that there are full powers to compel witnesses, to compel evidence in every local investigation that takes place. Those investigations will be directed by the National Commission, by the National Inquiry, as to where and how they take place to make sure they've got those full powers in place.
Chris Murray.
Deputy Speaker, the crime we are discussing today is not just an historic crime. It is happening right now out in communities, and we are failing to protect the current victims of this awful child abuse. So I welcome the new inquiry, but my concern is delay. We have had plenty of inquiries, task forces and reviews where the conclusions have not been implemented. My concern is that this new inquiry will monopolise our attention and not the focus on protecting victims right now. So will the Home Secretary commit that this inquiry will not detract or divert resource from the recommendations we know need to be implemented? And will she also commit that the child trafficking devolved pilot, which we know has been working for 4 years, will be rolled out nationally to protect child victims?
Yes, I can tell him that we are going to expand that, and also that we will not let up in the pace of implementing measures and recommendations. That includes the work the Education Secretary is doing already on mandatory reporting, mandatory sharing of data on children at risk, and also the unique identifiers, the work in the Crime and Policing Bill on mandatory reporting, but also, crucially, the police operation. So we have already increased the resources for the policing operations to be able to review closed cases. That is why we already have 800 cases identified for review. We expect that to rise very shortly to over 1,000 cases that were closed with no further action being taken, now being looked at again now, not waiting for the inquiry, but also taking action on them now in order to protect children.
Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Honourable Member for Sheffield South East and I are the sole members of the House that are still here that served on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee when we conducted the inquiries into Rotherham, both in November 2014 and March 2015. We heard from the victims then about the terrible abuse they'd suffered. We interviewed Dame Louise Casey at great length about her concerns about what was happening and what was being allowed to happen. And there's clearly something still going on, which is most prominent victims are young girls taken into care by local authorities from broken homes who've never experienced the love of a family. They then take a view that someone that gives them and expresses some form of love as being something they should like and enjoy. The reality is they're being ruthlessly exploited by individuals that should know better and are evil. The key here then is of concern is the lackadaisical approach that's been taken by many local authorities, social workers, the police and other bodies. And the concern that I have, and I'm sure other members have, and this is genuine, is that a local inquiry won't get those individuals who either turned a blind eye or actually participated in the abuse to actually give evidence. So will she ensure that those inquiries, witnesses called under oath, so that we can get to the bottom of this and make sure those people that turned a blind eye or connived are brought to justice as well as the perpetrators?
So I can reassure him that the point of having the national inquiry is to ensure that where local institutions are being examined, there will be the powers from the Commission to be able to compel witnesses, to be able to take evidence under oath, to be able to gather information, papers and evidence as they so see fit in order to make sure that we can get to the heart of institutional failure. But he's also right to say that this really is about vile criminals knowing when teenage girls especially, but when young children are vulnerable to the most appalling exploitation and coercion, the playing with children's emotions and vulnerability to draw them in to what is ultimately violent crime and the most terrible abuse. This does raise questions, particularly about the fact that the number of child protection cases identified around sexual abuse has dropped by social services. We are very concerned about that. The Education Secretary is now investigating that, and also the failure to share data properly around the children who are at risk, the ones who are going missing. It's the evidence from, I think, the work that he did and the committee did 10 years ago about missing children, about children in care. It's all the same evidence now. We've got to be better at pursuing that evidence.
Jodie Reid.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I strongly welcome the Home Secretary's announcement for an inquiry and its commitment to survivors. And it's absolutely right that the inquiry focuses on the local areas where we know survivors had been failed by the authorities which were supposed to protect them. But it's also essential that we draw the lessons for the whole of the UK. Earlier this year, Professor Alexis Jay from Strathclyde University warned the Home Affairs Select Committee that Scotland is not immune to this kind of organised abuse that we've witnessed elsewhere in the UK, and Scotland's victims and survivors deserve the same assurances of accountability and robust safeguarding measures as anywhere else in the UK. So can I ask the Home Secretary if she will actively seek engagement from the Scottish Government and offer its support and advice to help ensure it also wholeheartedly implements the J recommendations effectively?
I welcome my honourable friend's point. The Safeguarding Minister will follow up these issues with the devolved administrations. Obviously, she is right. Of course, this is a devolved issue for Scotland. Nevertheless, she's also right that this kind of appalling crime, this is happening everywhere, and this needs action everywhere in order to safeguard children and protect them.
I appreciate how sensitive the topic is, but longer questions mean fewer colleagues will get in, and obviously shorter answers from the Secretary of State will help as well. Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At one of my surgeries, I heard from a civil servant who had gathered evidence for the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse across the whole of England. They described themselves as being, quote, left emotionally and physically drained after collecting evidence, only for it not to have been acted on by the government. I welcome this government's acceptance of the 12 Casey review findings, but I ask the Secretary of State, will she assure my constituent and other civil servants that there will be no delay in implementing the findings of the IICSA?
Well, I can assure him we are taking forward the recommendations already. The Safeguarding Minister updated the House on all of the ICSA recommendations before Easter. Some of them require legislation, and that legislation is passing through, including passing through this House. At the moment, we will have further discussions on those issues later this week. Some of the issues are issues that we are able to take forward already, and we will continue to update the House on the progress on those recommendations.
Catherine Atkinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome this evidence-led action on grooming gangs? It takes courage to come forward and share deeply traumatic experiences. So will the Home Secretary confirm that this inquiry will build on the evidence and recommendations already collected over previous inquiries, investigations and reports, including the last national inquiry, which in 2022 produced this 200-page report specifically on grooming gangs and looked at over 400 recommendations that had prior to that already been made? And crucially, will she ensure that there is no delay to the action this government is already taken to bring perpetrators to justice, to stamp out these vile crimes and to protect our vulnerable children?
I agree with my honourable friend. We need to ensure that the 2-year inquiry into child sexual exploitation that was conducted as part of the Professor Alexis Jay review, those recommendations, we have agreed to implement all of those recommendations, and one of those on the aggravated sentencing for grooming offences we are taking forward as part of the Crime and Policing Bill. We are also introducing similar parallel arrangements for online abuse, because that online grooming as well, which obviously has escalated and accelerated since Professor Jay's work, we also need to make sure we're taking action on.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My Hillingdon constituents have seen the work over many decades the local authority has had to deal with child sexual exploitation and trafficking arising from Heathrow. One of the issues arising when I led the Local Government Association's response on this, when these cases first came to light, was the sharing of information. So will she assure the House that following this inquiry she will upgrade the status of the Working Together guidance, and in particular make sure those bodies accountable to the Home Office, like the police, understand and take it as seriously as other bodies do, so we don't see people falling through the cracks between agencies?
I welcome the honourable member's points on this. Baroness Casey's review does identify that sexual exploitation is a central part of trafficking and modern slavery as well. And I do also agree with him about the importance of the sharing of information. It's these basic things that just time and again everybody says the right words and then it just doesn't happen in practice. So we need the law to change, but we also need systems to change to make it easier to share that information. We will take that forward both in policing and as part of the work that my honourable friend, the Education Secretary, is doing, so that it's much easier for them to share that information.
We're introduced.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that there was no vote previously on whether or not to have a national inquiry into grooming gangs? The vote was about having the safeguards of the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill. And following the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and the 200-page, which dealt specifically with grooming gangs, this government was right to have the local inquiries and to have the rapid national audit. And now that Baroness Casey has recommended a national inquiry into grooming gangs, the party opposite should be working with us for the sake of the victims, rather than attempting to score political points as the leader of the opposition did.
Well, Baroness Casey's audit that was conducted in just 4 months, but looked at some of the issues in considerable detail, but also sets out really the fact that we have had these 16 years of different reports and inquiries. That does include some of the issues around the 200-page report that he refers to and other reports as well. The crucial thing is that we need action. So victims and survivors need answers, and we need to pursue serious failings wherever they are found, but we've also got to make sure that when recommendations are made, that they are implemented.
Minister Meddy.
We welcome the Government statement today and hope it will lead to concrete, properly funded actions. In February, Plaid Cymru amendments called on the Welsh Government to work with police forces on an all-Wales audit of child abuse cases across Wales, and it was backed unanimously. What concrete steps have been taken between the Welsh and UK governments since the passing of that vote to bring justice to these victims?
Well, the honourable member will know that there are obviously many of the issues around the social services provisions are obviously matters for the Welsh Government, but also issues around policing are covered by the Home Office, and that's why we have already